You can't stop fight or flight.
Mhm.
That is the most ingrained action we have, and it comes out in those high stress moments. And
Mhm.
you won't get leaders who look to flight. You shouldn't get leaders who look to flight. You get leaders who look to fight, but
Mhm.
fighting on the battle rather than the war is where the mistake is made.
Mhm.
But we have to train where the fight needs to take place rather than try and get the fight or flight instinct out of ourselves. And that's what the
Mhm.
puzzle tries to do.
Welcome to the Leadership Launchpad Project, changing the way the game is played. This podcast helps purpose-driven leaders unlock their highest potential so that they can play their biggest impact game. Welcome to the Leadership Launchpad Project, changing the way this game is being played. We are back in this locker room and so fired up because we have one of our favorite people coming to join us on the pod today. He is sage and he is wise and he packs a lot of punch in terms of his very inspiring, innovative ideas around leadership development and training. He's been a leader for decades. I'm going to pass the puck to Shelley to introduce our friend Nigel to our folks. Shelley, you want to tell our folks who this Nigel person is that I'm telling them all about off the draw?
100%.
Give them the backstory a little bit.
Backstory, yes. I've had the privilege of knowing Nigel for, how many years now, Nigel? I can't even remember. But Mr. Nigel Scott is definitely a bit of an industry legend and an icon in his own right. He's got well over 30 years of experience that encompasses founding 3 creative agencies, leading global creative projects, building teams, and transforming organizations with big tier 1 companies like Vodafone, Rogers, and Midnight Circus. Nigel is a one-man catalyst for collaboration, and he's also the creator of the People Puzzle. Nigel has developed a groundbreaking experiential approach that blends his knowledge, his behavioral science background, and organizational behavior. And I can't wait to dig in with you, Nigel, on a bit more about this amazing immersive experience that both Susan and I have had the privilege of experiencing ourselves.
Oh, yeah.
So over to you, Nigel, so that we can dig in on the People Puzzle.
Nigel, tell us about this people puzzle that we
Yes.
got to experience that we're so fired up about. Tell our people.
Yeah, morning. Thank you for way too many kind words. I don't quite know what to do with those at the moment. Um, Shelley, it's been about 8 years that we were working together.
Wow.
And in those 8 years, there's kind of been my own little transformation into where I am now, from leading an agency and recognizing that that isn't really what I want to do anymore. And I want to try and raise up the next level of leaders. And I think that, as we go through changing times, finding humanity amongst leadership is going to be the big quest that a number of us are on, so that we feel we can hand over the world into good, safe hands for the future that are based on understanding of people, and how that understanding of people translates into better workplaces. That for all of the consternation about AI, in reality, we're going to be all in workplaces for a long time into the future. And what we're seeing at the moment are workplaces filled with 4 generations of people. And those generations all have very different models of how work should be, could be, needs to be. And the lack of understanding that flows between those 4 generations could be very problematic if we don't start addressing it. And in some small way, that's what the people puzzle does. It's an experiential session that brings out instinctual, inherited behaviors that oddly are exactly the same regardless of the age of the person playing the puzzle, and opens up a conversation about how we all need to understand that those are the behaviors that we show naturally, and how we need to turn that instinct into intent, which is what a lot of what I talk about during the puzzle. And whilst there is some very deliberate environmental tricks built into how the puzzle works, I've been running it for 15 years now, and it consistently operates in exactly the same way. There is, I'll call it bad behavior, but there is instinctual behavior. For the first while of playing the game, then there is a moment of revelation that reaches the team, and the ripples of that revelation travel through all the participants, and you begin to realize, we should have been doing this a different way from the starting point. But instinct takes over every time.
I'm curious to understand, as a leader, Nigel, how did you come across this valuable insight? You're saying you've been doing this people puzzle for 15 years. We keep talking, Shelley and I, on this show about how it's 2025. Like, why are we still having such a hard time adopting these best practices in terms of how to develop our leaders? So, as a leader for decades, was this something that you came across as you were in the trenches, or is this something that you were formally educated on? Where was the initial inspiration or intuitive insight, right, that helped you crystallize this knowingness?
Yeah, it certainly wasn't education. I was a terrible student. Well, I was terrible at exams. I was a good student, terrible at exams. But all of it came from self-learning and my own curiosity about why do people behave the way they behave. It's funny, I was talking to some students last week, and I kind of trace it back to a childhood obsession with mass murderers. And why did they behave the way they behaved was a question that really intrigued me. And I went on a bit of a journey trying to understand that, and which led me to wanting to be an FBI profiler. But
no way.
I never knew that about you. Okay.
Yeah, no, me neither. Wow.
I just wasn't smart enough to go to college to take the course, but it didn't stop me becoming totally entranced by human behavior. And as I then progressed through my working career, I started using human behavior, firstly in a marketing way, for because I'd kind of doubled down on experiential marketing, understanding the need for emotional triggers and emotional motivators to nudge people along to form different habits from a marketing point of view. And then I was given the opportunity to apply that thinking to a leadership transformation project that was being run by Vodafone, and working in collaboration with the L&D teams from Vodafone, we dreamed up a 2.5-day training center that had deliberately designed environments and games and provocations that were all based on taking people to a moment of revelation, rather than using PowerPoint to say, you can't do that, you have to do this. And the impact of that was astounding. And it showed itself in both the number of people who kind of put their hand up and said, this company is not for me anymore, and resigned, as well as the number of people who went on to break out of silo leadership and functional leadership into understanding how to take in a matrix organization, admit that you were a subject matter expert, but you didn't have the answer to everything, and therefore allow other inputs into the way you were making decisions. And what it came down to a lot of the time was giving people the right language to use to broker the conversation that they wanted to have. And language is still incredibly powerful when it's all we have, really. Words are all we have to try and impart the idea. We're not quite in inception mode where we can invade people's dreams and plant the seed of an idea, and all we really have are the words that we use to try and influence someone. And so it's that understanding of how humans behave and what triggers them that I use for experiential marketing that then helped me develop an experiential series of L&D learning products. The people puzzle being the first one.
It was absolutely brilliant. I have to be
Right.
honest and talk about it to the audience, because myself and Susan have experienced it both firsthand. And, you know, I'm not going to give anything away, Nigel, at all. But my first sort of impression was the same instinct, funnily enough, right? Like you get in there into that room and into that experience, and again, it's like, how do you change that instinct and that human behavior as you automatically have that knee-jerk reaction to just solve, right? Because that's
Yeah.
who we are as people. We want to solve, we want to fix things, right? But as the experience continues and as you go through it, it's kind of like, oh, and there is, to your point, that aha moment that I think, you know, the whole game in itself, if you can transpose that into a leadership environment and stop having those knee-jerk reactions to solve and fix and look at the bigger picture, we'd all be better off, obviously. But Susan, what was your sort of thoughts as we were observing, by the way? So just observing, you know, we had like C-suite leaders and like all different levels that you would think that would automatically show up a bit differently. But again, that human behavior, just instinct kicks in, right? What did you
I
think?
I immediately felt like I was back in one of my high performance hockey locker rooms, to be honest with you. Like it's something that I feel so blessed and privileged to have experiential learning around, right? Is like what happens to our brain, our choices, our behavior when our nervous system gets stimulated by a challenge that we don't necessarily have a solution for, right? All that uncertainty that we know puts a leader into the tunnel, cognitively speaking, right? It's just, for me, I think it's so valuable because you're right. We cannot learn how to modify our behavior or the state that we are in as we are in these high pressure, high stakes environment through a freaking PowerPoint. That is not how human beings are hardwired, right? I think to be able to be dropped in that human high performance lab and to be able to have those humans experience it their damn selves gives so much proof and evidence to the belief systems that we have a hard time sometimes, right? Developing in some of these old school leadership mindsets. And so I think, yeah, for me, the biggest takeaway is that this is absolutely going to change the game in terms of leadership development, right? This understanding that I know we've known about for some time in terms of the data and the research, right? But like Nigel was riffing on off the draw, we're about to go through like our biggest disruption since the arrival of the internet. And so we
Yeah.
know predictably what that's going to do to a leader's experience. We know the kind of unresourceful state that they might be trapped in. So I just can't imagine a better opportunity to get ahead of that disruption so you can capitalize on that disruption than getting your leaders developed in this really new school innovative way. I want to talk about that though, in terms of the leader. When they get into that high pressure, high stakes environment, they know they have all these expectations to answer for, and then there's this massive disruption that's added into the equation. What do we predict behaviorally is going to be the knee-jerk reaction from our folks? Let's go there for a second as a collective of leadership development experts. Nigel, what are your thoughts on that? I know you're in the locker room with this game, so you must be seeing some of that popping up on the play.
Yeah, I think Shelley hit it on the head, really. It's so much easier to try and solve It takes far less mental capacity to try and solve, and the act of doing is far less of a resource strain. That's where you go. The using your brain to properly analyze, critique, think about, okay, what's the impact of this and what does that mean? And if I take that step, what does that mean my next step will be? And calculating through the ripples is really hard work. Really hard work. So much more hard work than solving step number one without thinking about step number two. And you see a lot of chasing a tail because you think that that's the tail that needs to be chased. I saw it experientially when, 9, 10 years ago, everyone was talking about there's going to be these headsets that everyone wants to wear for VR and AR. And we chased the tail trying to create things for that were completely wrong because the uptake wasn't what it was, but it was much easier to try and solve for that people are talking about instead of pausing, taking a moment to think about, okay, if this is true, then what else needs to be true to allow that to happen? The amount of time actually thinking through an issue is just not given to leaders these days, whether they have to write a deck or waiting for a deck and then have to make a decision. And I think that, fundamentally leaders shouldn't be the decision point. They should be the influence of the journey. And then the decision kind of finds its own way to the top. And too many times leaders have said, shall I do this? And without enough context at all, there's a solve, that's a piece of action, let's go and do that. And I think that that's going to have to be a fundamental shift in the way that leaders operate.
So for me, one of the things that I definitely took away from that experience, which is still prevalent, quite truthfully, and I have to thank you for that, Nigel, in my life today, is that problem solving initial reaction. And so now going through this experience, whenever there's a problem in front of me or something that needs to be solved or fixed right away, again, that's just innate in who I was, fix, solve. I'm now taking a step back, breathing. Am I missing the bigger picture here? And just based on your AR and VR, analogy that you just gave, it's the same. You can use this tool, and this newfound sort of like revelation that you have in your life, where it's like, what am I missing? I'm looking at the bigger picture versus just the problem that's sitting right in front of you. Now, one of the questions that I do have for you, because I'm dying to know, because we were talking about generations. When people from different generations are coming in and experiencing the puzzle, are you seeing different reactions, different immediate reactions with, Gen X, Gen Z, I'm assuming not Gen Alpha yet, but are you seeing different reactions through different generations?
Well, it's been interesting over the last few months as I've been running my own sessions. I very deliberately got in different kinds of people. You can imagine 15 years ago when we did this for Vodafone, it was 45-year-old white men in the main. And, they all displayed exactly what 45-year-old white men would display. And they're all exactly the same. I've had the opportunity. I played the puzzle with my kid who's 15 and a bunch of his friends. I was terrified thinking, okay, what are teenagers going to make of this? Identical. Even though they hadn't started the workplace, they hadn't been conditioned into what work is. Identical behaviors. I did it with a team who were 4 or 5 months into a job. They were all in a kind of digital media marketing agency. They did a lot of influencer stuff. Identical. Big difference there. They all filmed themselves being terrible at it, but they're all terrible at it. I've done sessions that were mainly female, identical. I've done matrix, functional, siloed teams, identical, because we cannot rid ourselves of the instincts that have been passed down through the generations of this is how we do things. And again, tricks in the puzzle bring back some of those memories and some of the ways that you operate when you're in a classroom. The one thing I haven't done that I often wonder if it'll be totally different was set the puzzle up with cameras everywhere, and I leave the room instead of being present in the room, and whether that would be any different, but that's coming shortly.
Okay, Susan, I've got to punt this back
The
to you.
observer effect, right? Is that what you're trying to mitigate?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Because
Exactly.
it definitely changes, I
Yeah.
think, your awareness when you're being observed, right? Versus when you just can do what you would do when no one's looking. No, when an authority figure isn't looking over your shoulder.
Yeah, completely. And it's interesting when I talk to people about it, they often say, "Oh, I'd probably have cheated," and I'm like, "What are you cheating against? You just there is no cheating to do.
There's no triggered school memories.
Do exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Shelley, what were you
Susan,
gonna say?
I'm dying to ask you this question, more so for you than anyone else, because you have such a wealth of expertise in this. It's to Nigel's point, if every single generation demographic are experiencing the puzzle the exact same way in terms of that initial instinct, where is that ingrained? Like, we know our limiting beliefs are set by the age of 10, but is it prior to that? Is it something that we just are teaching that we're not aware of as parents, like, or schools? Like, where does that come from?
Well, to be specific, the amygdala, which is
Okay.
the most primal part of our brain, right? That gets triggered by uncertainty. And I think, something that we have witnessed firsthand in our locker rooms over the last 20 years of developing leaders, right? Is that, when we are triggered into uncertainty, our knee-jerk reaction is to try and supercompensate through means of external control, right? And so that obviously is what he's referring to when we get into that high achiever mode of trying to fix and trying to solve with our perfectionist strategies, Like, I think it's just another way, especially in a social context. You got to know, right? Like that high achiever mindset is definitely going to try to win. High achievers are very competitive because they need to seek that external validation as a form of safety outside of themselves, right? So I think that's what's going on when he talks about how behaviorally, whether it's, Gen Alpha, millennials, boomers, X, like wherever we are on the spectrum, Gen Zs, we're all human beings and we're all hardwired in that primal way still. That's universal. Our response to stress is universal. And that's why we say predictably, when you're in the high pressure, high stakes, and you're thrown a challenge, that you predictably are going to go into the tunnel, cognitively speaking, because that's how the brain tries to keep you safe and alive, which is its job. And it takes that job very seriously. So in an upregulated sympathetic state, a brain has to seek some form of control in order to manage their stress and anxiety. So I think that's where that's coming from. Like, I gotta fix, I gotta solve. I think throw in some layers of high achiever mindset strategy, which we know is what we work on in our locker rooms. I think it's pretty predictable, right? Like, what's going to happen is a knee-jerk reaction in any leader's experience.
I find it absolutely fascinating.
You can't stop fight or flight. That is the most ingrained action we have, and it comes out in those high stress moments. And you won't get leaders who look to flight. You shouldn't get leaders who look to flight. You get leaders who look to fight, but fighting on the battle rather than the war is where the mistake is made. But we have to train where the fight needs to take place rather than try and get the fight or flight instinct out of ourselves. And that's what the puzzle tries to do.
Where do you feel the fight lies, out of curiosity? Because you used it in that context, and we're talking about stepping back and practicing the pause, which is kind of how we help our leaders down-regulate that up-regulated state. But where do you see the fight, being necessary for leaders to pivot towards in that context?
Well, I think that you have to understand what the end goal is actually going to be that you are fighting against. And let's take AI for it. It's going to steal our jobs. That's not actually the end state that we are in, but that's the battle that lots of people are trying to fight, as opposed to that leaning into it, understanding it, figuring out how it can enhance. I was at something that the PEO put on, and a much wiser man than me said, if you're worrying about what's happening with AI in your workplace today, then you're in the wrong place. You need to be figuring out what won't be existing in 5 years' time because of AI. And that's the difference in the mentality. LinkedIn's filled with creatives saying this AI is terrible. It should be done by humans. And they're right in a way, but it's the wrong battle to fight. You have to figure out, okay, where's the end game? What will be going on in 5 years' time? And finding the time, the capacity, and being allowed to sit in that problem for long enough is what we need to get into the habit of doing. And time and being allowed to think about a problem for long enough for the right reasons is really hard in today's workplace. Really hard.
Because everyone wants an answer right now in this moment, right?
You can activate a curious state, and you can't be curious enough to get up in the box with it, right? Where the breadth becomes available to you cognitively, unless you have enough space to actually be able to manage the stress. The stress is predictable, right? But the space to be able to down-regulate it, I feel like, is where we're missing the link still.
But on what you were just talking about, AI, I mean, we hear about this all the time, right? But it's the analogy going back to what you gave about VR and the headsets and, how do we get ahead of the curve here? That's every leader's, how do you get ahead of the curve, right? And how do you get ahead of the problem that we could potentially be facing? I think in retrospect, like when you go back in that experience that you had, the knee-jerk reaction to solve, to how would you do that differently now with the AI? Is it just and recommending for other leaders? Is it just giving the time and the space to figure out where it fits in your business, where you're going to have some roadblocks in your business as a result of AI coming out? Like, how would you coach a leader on that in terms of not having that knee-jerk reaction and the experience that you had with VR?
Well, I think you need to understand and you need to spend time thinking about what is going to be going on in 5 years' time. And the difficulty is with AI, you kind of think, well, anything could be going on. There is infinite possibilities. Is the fear that is driving at the moment. But you need to be able to take that fear, concern, apply it to what your horizon is, probably 5 years for what your business is going to be, and then make some decisions about how you believe your business will change. Because it will be a 5-year period before it changes in that way, and there are steps along the way. But unless you're clear on, in 5 years, these are the changes I believe are going to be happening, or at least you make some of your own decisions and assumptions on this is what I believe will be going on in 5 years' time, you can't ever make the right first step towards that end point. And not enough time is spent just thinking about what is the end game that we are going to be in. And it's not what's the end game for the next generation or what's the end game for, even 10 years' time, but just what's the end game for the next 3-year operating plan that we have, and how do I take the right steps along that journey that's where we need to be spending our time now, not fixing the immediate frontline problem. Fix it
Firefighting.
in a way. Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I just don't think
We
enough
st-
organizations give enough breadth and depth and space for leaders to be able to do that, right?
No, no, I don't believe they do. And breadth is an interesting word there as well, Shelley. It's something I have a little collaboration equation that I like to talk about. Breadth plus connections equals originality. And I, the wider you consider a problem, you'll find new connections that might not be immediately visible, which will bring you to a more original thought.
Love that.
Finding breadth is something that a lot of leaders find really hard to do because they take on the mantle of, I should have the answer. You shouldn't. Let's admit that. You shouldn't have the answer because you're too far removed from where the problem truly is. So finding breadth of inputs into how do I solve something is the first step. But that takes time and it takes a very open mind. And those two things don't come together very easily in the workplace. And you have to make sure you're finding time to allow that to happen.
Yeah, that's the struggle for most leaders, right? Is they can't get out of their fixed mindset because of the stress that they're under, calling it motivation. And
Yes.
so
Yeah.
everything that we're talking about today
Nice.
requires the growth mindset. And you can't activate a growth mindset unless you can activate a curious state. And you can't be curious enough to get up in the box with it, right? Where the breadth becomes available to you cognitively
Yeah.
unless you have enough space to actually be able to manage the stress. The stress is predictable, right? But the space to be able to down-regulate it, I feel like is where we're missing the link still.
Yeah.
Right? In terms of operations and how we set our people up to work. I think this is why we're saying we want to change the way this game's being played because we see this as an opportunity to reimagine how we relate to work and orient ourselves in the context of work. I think that's the most important part in this whole equation that Nigel just laid out is like we have to be able to have enough space to get up in the box with it with enough curiosity, because that's where we're actually going to shift our focus from having to fix and solve and control to seeing where the opportunities lie. You know, disruption as a word in and of itself has such a bad rap. I think our associations with that can be kind of brutal sometimes. Look what the internet has done for our world, right? And our capacity as human beings in a professional sense. I keep boasting about how I get to go run off and on my lunch break to see my kid play volleyball at her school now because I get to work around the world through a computer. So that to me is where we got to go with it is the brain training around our associations, right? And I think disruption in an economic sense, you know, investors look for disruption, entrepreneurs look for disruptive things, right? Because that oftentimes is where the biggest opportunities for growth lie. You know, it's funny in hockey, we were always trained to skate where the puck was going to be, not where the puck was. I
Yeah.
want to know where the puck is going to be. This is the last place I want to cover with you, sir, before we let you off air here. Where's the puck going to be in terms of this leadership development game that we're all obviously fervently on our missions to affect change around? Where do you think in the next 5 to 10 years through the disruption of all of this AI, where do you think leadership practices in the development space are going to be?
I think that we're going to see a lot of things commoditized that need management rather than leadership, if you like. And there will need to be a different nature of how you manage process that we need to learn. I think the things that can't be commoditized and that continue to offer true value is thought and genuine creativity and the way in which problems are solved through innovative collaboration to take us to new places that we are in control of. And I think that leadership is going to have to start looking at those ways to enhance, to be able to let managers manage a commoditized process a lot of the time. And then there is that last 20% that needs true, genuine leadership that continues to connect to the real world and the real emotions of people. Because, you know, for all that the world might change, it's still going to be a human being that you're trying to convince to buy your product, to buy your service, to be part of your gang, whatever that gang might be. And that can't be replicated without empathy and understanding. And we need to carry on that journey right now. I personally, and I'm a happy Luddite at times, but I really don't see that changing. And I think that empathy, understanding, telling great stories is still going to be the way we have to see change through, because it's reassuring. It's so reassuring in times of change to have people who say, yeah, it's changing, but that's okay because this changed before and that will change again. And you still need that touch point of human reality to guide. And people love to be led. They love to be led. They love to know there is someone here who knows where we're going, or at least has a roadmap for where we think we need to get to. And they love that. And leaders are going to have to continue to show they have the desire and the commitment to carry on fighting the right fight and not flying in the face of the challenges. And that can only be done in real life with that empathy and understanding of what human behaviors we're going through.
I love that.
I know that our folks are going to want to reach out to you and continue this conversation off air, Nigel. For everybody listening out there who's curious to come connect with you, where can they find you?
LinkedIn's probably the easiest. Nigel Scott. I don't know if there are many of me out there with that same. I've never done that, Googling. So Nigel Scott on LinkedIn or Nigel at peoplepuzzleexperience.com.
There's only one Nigel in our locker room, and we're so lucky to know him and have had him in today to contribute to this incredibly crucial, requisite conversation around human-centric leadership development. We happen to agree. This is why empathy was rated the #1 leadership skill of them all, right, in 2024.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that is where we got to go to find the certainty in the uncertainty, right, Nigel? Is like remembering that is never going to change. And yes, machines might come and take some things off of our plate from a process-oriented standpoint. But yeah, the reality is that is the certainty within the storm, right? Is that connection with one another and our ability to support each other through the evolution of work. Shelley, what are your final thoughts for today?
Oh boy, that's a big one. I mean, I've known Nigel for a bit, and I meant that full heartedly when I said earlier in his intro that he is an industry legend and an icon. And Nigel continues to shake up the industry, make everyone sit up a little bit taller. And through this experience, I mean, I experienced it myself, right? It actually did solidify in my brain coming out of the people puzzle experience, looking at problems very, very differently. So, Nigel, I have to thank you for that, in all honesty.
Thank you, Shelley. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful to see other colleagues of ours who we respect so much really stepping into this innovative space. You know, we're kind of the first ones on the scene here in the leadership development world to throw leaders in a locker room, right? And to get them in the mental gym where they can have all of that experiential integration for the purposes of behavior modification. Leadership being a set of behaviors after all. This is why it's so confusing to us, why this evolution has taken its damn time getting here. But yeah, we could not be in a better place to serve our collective of fellow human beings right now on all fronts. So you heard from Nigel where to find him. Go find him if you're ready to get the people puzzle started in your leadership development growth game. Come find us at elitehighperformance.com if you're curious to learn more about our locker rooms, everything in and around this human-centric development we've been riffing on today. We are in the year of co-creation, Nigel. That's our anchor word here at the Leadership Launchpad Project. So please, please, please reach out to me directly. Give me that feedback. I want to know if this interview is hitting the mark. I want to know what else you got triggering that amygdala right now in your leadership mindset that you might want to learn more about. You can send me an email, susan@elitehighperformance.com. Don't forget to share this episode with a friend who might be up against the disruption, not in a resourceful way. Remember to hit like and subscribe. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see everyone back here next week in the locker room. Have a great week, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.